Our lunch speaker, you should have just received a handout with her bio on it. Laura Carstensen is the Fairleigh Dickinson Professor of Public Policy and Director of the Stanford Center on Longevity. Has been instrumental in, as a co-sponsor, her center is co-sponsoring this conference, and she's been instrumental in putting it together. I'm looking forward very much to her talk, and I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. So I'll shut up and let her begin.
Thanks, Hank. And let me thank you, Hank, more generally, and Ken, for putting all this together and making it work so well. This has been a really, really interesting day, and I appreciate your including me today and including us in the larger conference. What I want to do is to, in some ways, just kind of sum up and maybe pull together a lot of different pieces of information that you've been hearing from others throughout the morning. And to talk about ways that aging may be associated with some types of decline that are normal, that are reliable. That is, I'll be talking about normal aging, things that will happen to all of us as we get older if we're lucky enough to stay alive. And I won't say too much about dementia, but I'll talk about some of those normal age-related changes that are negative, that none of us look forward to. But I'm also going to talk about some of the changes that occur that appear to be beneficial and may even offset and could be even related to some of the decline. So what I think I'll do is to just kind of give you a bird's eye view of adult development from a psychological perspective, what's happening cognitively, motivationally, emotionally. So I made up this slide to summarize all research on aging. Just any variable you like, you can put here. And here's the presumption is that the older we get, the worse it'll be. I think that this also guides most research on aging as well. So most scientists who are walking into the laboratory with hypotheses to test about aging often hold similar kinds of views. And I wish I could tell you that this is a total joke, that none of it's true, that really aging only brings gains, but it doesn't. I mean, there is a lot of decline. There are a lot of changes that are unwelcomed. The more we learn about aging, the more we see that this kind of a trajectory, however, clearly does not characterize normal aging. That the declines and the gains together create a much more nuanced and really a more interesting kind of a story about the kinds of developmental changes we see over time. So I'll start with the bad news. These are real data now, look a lot like that trajectory slide I just showed you. These are data from a study from Tim Salthouse's group. And what you're seeing is a composite of scores on a number of different measures that tap processing speed and integrity. So the ability to uptake, learn, store, and efficiently digest new information. These are cross-sectional data, but these have been shown longitudinally as well. And it looks like we see this kind of decline regardless of education level, socioeconomic status, occupation, gender, race. So we're seeing this kind of a negative slope across different groups of people. Now clearly, some people start higher than others. So you'll see some older people processing information faster than some younger people, but probably not as fast as they used to. So it seems to be highly reliable and consistent. This slope, I like to point out whenever I get the chance, especially when talking to a group of young people, is pretty steady. It looks like 23 is the number that you start to see the decline. And it continues it to whatever is old ages as have been studied. What I like to point out is that the slope from 20 to 30 is as steep as the slope from 70 to 80. It's not like these changes suddenly come about. It's not a threshold. It's not like you suddenly become old, you become 65, and things are suddenly different, but rather these are changes that come on very, very gradually across adulthood, which is probably why most of us in our 50s, 60s, 70s don't feel incapacitated. Don't feel like we can't get up and make it through the day and learn new things and process information. There's a lot of accommodation that goes on over these same years. Now, this pattern is what has been studied by cognitive psychologists more than any other aspect of cognitive aging. It's the decline, it's processing speed. So this would include things like the mental rotation, the ability to rotate an object in your head mentally, taking other perspectives on physical space. It would include many different forms of memory, but centrally it includes working memory. So there are a lot of different kinds of memory: procedural memory, how to do things, how to ride a bike, drive a car, unaffected by aging. Working memory is ability to hold information online, keep it in your head while you operate on it. So I could give you a string of numbers, and the numbers are going by and going by and going by, and every once in a while I stop the string and I say, what was the number, 3 numbers prior to the number I just told you? Call that an in-back task. So you've got to hold the information online while you operate on it. Working memory, some people argue, is really at the core of all of the decline that we see. You see decrements in, say, the efficiency of reading new information or new learning because of this change in working memory. Some people argue that it's primarily speed, that the decline in speed with which we can uptake new information is even at the bottom of working memory. So there's this kind of back and forth, but that's the core change that we see. What doesn't get nearly as much, let me sum up this. So I know you won't remember any of what I told you about the decline in working memory, so I sum it up with a cartoon. It's one of my favorite Larson cartoons, High Above the Hush Crowd. Rex trying to remain focused, still he couldn't shake what nagging thought. He was an old dog, this was a new trick. It's new information, it's novel situations that seem to be most troublesome for us as we grow older. But as I say, other changes occur as well and get far less attention. And this is another reliable finding, and that is that knowledge goes up across these same years that processing speed is going down. So the story is it's harder to learn new information. It takes more repetitions before we remember things, but people do continue to learn as they grow older. And so if you have a measure or a test of culture, of vocabulary, of expertise, general knowledge, older people generally perform better than younger people. And these are also reliable patterns. And let me say that the tests of knowledge include things like knowledge about the world, about culture. Older people perform reliably better than younger people on those kinds of tests. And I'll add that tests of knowledge probably, in all likelihood, underestimate grossly expertise. Because tests of knowledge have to be general tests. They have to be tests about general knowledge, but they aren't tests on your lawyering abilities. They aren't tests on what you know in a particular avocation that you have that you've been working on, because those would have to be much more specific. So we're, in all likelihood, I mean really undoubtedly, we're underestimating the increase in knowledge that we see across these same years. Tim Salthouse, a major figure in this field, argues that it's possible that we don't need as much processing capacity as we get older because of this knowledge, that the knowledge is offsetting the decline, which again gives you this different feeling subjectively than you would guess if you just looked at the first, at the red line and you said, this is what's happening to my brain or my mind. Why probably Barbara Strauch was talking this morning about feeling even like we could do things better. There are a lot of things we do a lot better as we get older, even though we can experience subjectively, and most of us do experience subjectively, this decline in working memory. The other areas where we see it are things like retrieval of information rapidly, like the name of the person who you just bumped into out at the over the lunch table, and you know the person, and you could tell me everything about them, but you can't remember their name. quickly is something that also changes with age. It's those kinds of changes. So it's retrieval, speed, efficiency, and processing that seems to change. Psychologists like to tell people that if you want to think of a particular situation that would be really bad for you or really difficult as an older person, imagine the cockpit of an airplane where you've got lots of different information changing rapidly, all coming at you, and you have to process it and then integrate it and act on it very quickly. And so that's been the example that we have given for years as the example of what you don't want to become in your second career. But then at Bloomberg in 2009, we had an event, an example that spoke very much against that kind of a model, although, of course, Sully Sullenberger, who became a national hero overnight, was 59 years old. He'd been a pilot for his entire career, but he was an older pilot, and he was nonetheless able to maneuver a landing in the Hudson after a flock of birds flew into the plane, avoiding the Manhattan streets. Can you imagine the tragedy had the plane landed in Manhattan? And landing it sufficiently easily that all 150 passengers, including one baby, walked away unharmed. Sullenberger was asked many times about his ability to do that, and when he responded, he said he wasn't really sure. It would be hard to explain exactly what he did. He wasn't thinking about it. It was automatic. It was procedural. It was that kind of memory that isn't affected by age. You know, it's driving a car or riding a bike, and he said he was able to do that. The airline said that they wouldn't force him to retire, that he could continue flying. And he said, oh, no, I don't want to ever be in that situation again. And so he did retire shortly after that and wrote a book, and we call that Wisdom. Now, it was only 4 or 5 months later that there was another tragedy, another airplane crash. It was in Buffalo, New York. There were 2 pilots, aged 47 and 24. Plane went down about 8 miles shy of the Buffalo airport. All 49 passengers were killed, including the owner of the house into which the airplane crashed. And an analysis of the accident showed that the crash was due entirely to pilot error, to lack of experience, and fatigue. So we have these examples of times where what one might predict from the basic data available on information processing speed and so on that look very different than what we see here. Again, it makes you think of the Salthouse argument that there may be an offset between decline and processing capacity and knowledge and ability and expertise. We've talked a fair amount this morning about financial decision making, and one of the panelists mentioned, Sam McClure, I believe, mentioned David Leibson, a Harvard economist, who published a paper recently called The Age of Reason. And this is an analysis of data in the Health Retirement Survey, a national representative sample that's been run by the National Institutes of Aging for many years now, where they follow people over time. And Leibson analyzed, according to age, people's performance across 10 different credit markets. And the analysis was, are you overpaying or underpaying fees? How good is your mortgage? Are you paying the lowest? Do you have the best deals in these different credit markets? And what Leibson found was that 53 is the magic age where people are making the best financial decisions, according to this analysis of portfolio. And what he's arguing is it's right about the point where you see this crossover. And he speculates that when young people don't perform as well because they don't have enough knowledge, that they're ignorant about the actual financial decisions and the products that are available to them, and older people begin to make more mistakes because of cognitive decline. That's what Leibson is arguing. Leibson is a brilliant economist, and this is a really interesting analysis, it is important to keep in mind that he has no data on people's cognitive ability. This is just a national survey, just looking at credit markets and who's got the best portfolio, right? So that's what he's looking at. So we don't know that it's cognitive decline that is contributing to people's portfolios in their 70s or 80s. But it is an interesting hypothesis. It does raise an interesting hypothesis. Now, Leibson is arguing that we need new policies to help protect older people's assets. And we've also heard, discussion about that this morning. One of the problems Leibson articulates is that we have been in recent decades not only failing to prepare older people in ways that would help them manage their finances, but we've been increasingly saying, you do it. Individuals, transferring from pensions to individual planning and so on, and retirement savings. We offer very little help in how to spend down retirement savings. And we're telling people they need to do it on their own. And Leibson's saying, we're doing all this and making all these changes right at a time where we're having a rapidly aging society and headed to a point in time where we're going to have trillions of dollars be transferred from one generation to another. And we better be careful for this reason, that you wouldn't want that wealth to be mismanaged, to be squandered, to be misused in a way that would be damaging to the individuals and to their families. So we hear this kind of a debate, and the kind of policy debate that follows is one that in some ways really troubles me, because we are attaching chronological age to people's performance. And I think of all the people I know in my life in their 70s and so on who would shudder at the idea of asking their children to take over managing their finances, and who are doing just fine. The other thing I've thought about is there are a lot of other reasons, I think, as a 58-year-old, that people may not have the best financial portfolio. Like, do you really want to go get a new mortgage every 5 years? Or have you decided that you can handle the one that you have, and so you're not going to worry about getting another half of a percentage point less or something like that? So there are lots of reasons people may decide, make, I would say, informed decisions about their portfolios other than cognitive decline. But generally, when older people do anything differently than younger people, we say, oh, it's cognitive decline. And I think that's an issue that needs to be considered very carefully and thoughtfully. So that appears to be the story, in a nutshell, I should say, about cognitive development in adulthood. We're slower, we're less agile, but we're learning, and we continue to develop expertise. In the emotion domain, we have some really good news. It is so surprising it makes headlines, but it appears that older people are not only doing well emotionally, they're doing better than middle-aged and younger people, certainly younger people by far. Early adulthood, very hard time emotionally. And older people seem to be reasonably content, satisfied in day-to-day life. They're saying that they feel quite good. You saw a slide that Ken Smith showed this morning for a survey from the CDC where the question put to participants was, in the last 2 weeks, have you suffered significant emotional distress? And fewer older people answered affirmatively to that than middle-aged or younger people. And a recent Gallup poll where people were asked about the day before. Did they experience stress, or how much stress did they experience? Worry, anger, all of those are reported at lower rates by older adults than younger adults. Now, these are cross-sectional findings. That is, we're comparing different age cohorts, different generations at one point in time. And there are a couple concerns people have had about surveys, some of these also raised in this room, where maybe older people are just putting a positive spin on an otherwise horrible existence. Or maybe the greatest generation is and always has been the greatest generation. That is, maybe this is about this special generations, these cohorts of people, but that younger people today shouldn't expect or anticipate that they'll actually get better. So maybe it's not a developmental change, but rather something that reflects generational differences in emotional well-being and regulation. About 15 years ago, my students and colleagues and I began a longitudinal study of emotional experience in everyday life and followed people over about, now it's about a 15-year period. Originally, the participants were aged 18 to 94, and they carried an electronic pager, and five times a day for 7 days, at random times, they were paged, and each time they were paged, we would ask them to tell us the degree to which they're feeling 19 different emotions at that moment. This kind of emotional measure is considered the gold standard of emotional measurement because you're tapping people right at the moment. And it's a very different thing. I mean, I ask you this question now, like, tell me now on a scale of 1 to 7, how angry are you? That's a different question than if I ask you, are you an angry person? Or similarly, how happy are you now? Or are you happy, in general? The latter, those kinds of more general questions are very cognitive and evaluative, and you're deciding how you feel compared to other people. Whereas if we're just saying, how do you feel right now, at this moment? It tends to give people a better sense of the daily, day in, day out of emotional experience that people have. And what we found longitudinally now, across about 15 years, is that indeed, this is positive experience, so it's basically positive, reports of positive emotions minus the negative, increase over this period of time, into 70s, 80s. It looks here, this is curve fitting, so this is not actually a decline we see out here, although there are some studies that find a slight downward trajectory in the very old in terms of emotional experience, but by and large, we're seeing emotional experience improve across adulthood. And as I say, again, it's younger people who are having a much more difficult time. So younger people are experiencing much more sadness, anger, stress, worry than older people are. And even if we take this very slight downturn in advanced old age as being a reliable finding, at no point does it return to the levels that we see in younger adults. So it looks like emotion is following a very different trajectory. It really looks like it's following that same trajectory that knowledge is on. So we're seeing improvement across time as opposed to decline across time. A lot of people have referred to this finding as the paradox of aging. How can it be that with all that goes wrong as people grow older, they're getting happier? They're suffering cognitive losses, suffering physical losses. We've heard also their social spheres are getting smaller. They're interacting with other people less. All the things we think make people happy are changing in a negative way, and older people are getting happier. My colleagues and I have developed a theory called Socioemotional selectivity theory, which attempts to explain this phenomenon. That is, social worlds are growing smaller, but emotionally they're doing better. And the theory is really grounded in the uniquely human ability to monitor time, not just clock time and calendar time, but lifetime. All of us know that we're mortal. We know that we won't live forever. And we can make very good guesses, and do make very good guesses, about approximately how much time we've got left. So if I look at a young person in the room, your time horizon, you anticipate a longer future than I do. And that's a highly reliable kind of a finding. We monitor time, we think, at consistently, day in, day out, at a subconscious level. And then as we get older, also, we're primed with events like the death of a loved one, an illness, some sort of a change in our own physical functioning that also primes at an acute, explicit level us in a way that reminds us that we aren't going to live forever. So time horizons grow shorter as people grow older. And because chronological age is associated with time left in life, we see systematic differences and the kinds of goals that people pursue as they grow older. Goals are always set in temporal contexts. We can't really pursue a goal without having some sort of a temporal frame around it. According to the theory, and we've heard other people talk about this this morning as well, when time horizons are vast and nebulous, as they typically are in youth, people tend to be collectors, explorers, taking risks, meeting people, engaging in relationships, even if they don't feel good, taking inorganic chemistry, for example, or a really tough law course. Younger people seem to be ready and willing to engage in these kinds of endeavors, even if it doesn't feel good emotionally. Why? Because something based on that experience may well pay off in the future. Taking a hard course when you're very young, one that's difficult emotionally, may open doors that will improve your life immeasurably in the future. And so younger people are willing to, for example, go on blind dates. You know, if it doesn't work out, there's always tomorrow. As people get older, they become more selective, more careful about who they're investing in, who they're spending time with. So social spheres narrow, and people tend to feel more secure as they get older. When time horizons are short, people tend to live in the moment, in the present, and tend to see more clearly. I think, Rita, I heard you say this earlier today, see clearly what's important and what's not. You know, this clarity improves. People come to invest in sure things. For most people, those sure things and those things that mean the most are other people and relationships. And so they invest more in a more narrow range of life. And it looks like this is good for mental health. So if you day in, day out, go through life, pursuing goals that feel good, that feel satisfying, that give you some sense of meaning in life, emotionally, that's better for you than if you go through life exploring and taking risks and doing things that don't feel good because the goal may pay off later. And that's, in a nutshell, what socioemotional selectivity theory predicts. We've done a lot of research over the last 20 years, testing different hypotheses that are derived from this theory. But the one that we've been investigating most in the last 5 or so years is the postulate that, or the hypothesis that people will attend to in attention and memory and cognitive processing information that is most salient. And because what's most salient changes to what's most emotionally meaningful with age, that as we grow older, we'll process information about emotion differently, and we'll attend to emotion more in everyday life. I mean, the simple way of thinking about this is that, you know, brains don't operate like computers. We're not taking in all the information in our environments even-handedly, but rather our goals direct attention and resources to particular kinds of information. So if you're walking across campus here at Stanford and you're looking for these beautiful woodpeckers in the trees in the quad, you might walk right past a friend of yours. But if you're looking for your friend, you'll walk right past that bird, no question, and you won't see it. So we're always being directed by our goals. So goals change systematically. Maybe we'll see age differences in cognitive processing. We began a series of studies on what is now called the positivity effect. Older people disproportionately remember positive information in their environments over negative information relative to younger people. I'll show you 3 different findings from 3 different studies that address the positivity effect. And one of the first ones we ran, we simply showed younger, middle-aged, and older people images on a computer screen like the ones that you're seeing here. Some are positive, this is positive. Some are negative, and some are neutral. And they see a series of these images, and after the images conclude, we ask them to simply recall all of the images that they can. So tell us what you just saw. They don't know it's a memory test as they're beginning to process these images. They just are watching them. And viewing them. And then we ask them, again, to recall all that they can. And what you see here is that younger people remember comparable numbers of the positive and the negative images. By middle age, we already see what we're now calling this positivity effect emerge, a relative preference in memory for the positive material as opposed to the negative. And in older adults, this is a whopping effect, where they're remembering many more of the positive images than the negative images. Now, I always like to point out that most studies on cognitive aging bring older and younger people into the laboratory, and they use neutral stimuli, the ones that nobody remembers very well, but older people really don't remember well. Now, this isn't to say that there really isn't something real about memory decline with age. There is, and we find it as well. But we may be putting older people in our studies at a disadvantage by relying so heavily on experimental stimuli that have no personal relevance whatsoever. In this kind of a behavioral study, we don't know if this is attention or memory. Is it that people aren't attending to these images when we present them, or is it that they're not storing them in memory? And so we ran another study, this time with John Gabrielli, who is now at MIT, but was at the time a colleague of ours here at Stanford. And what we did was to have the participants view the same set of images, but in a brain scanner. So we could look at amygdala activation as they were viewing the images. We were interested in this study in amygdala activation during the viewing. So the data I'm going to show you now are not related to memory, but the processing of the stimuli. And what we found is that in younger adults, when they're viewing positive and negative images, the amygdala activation looks exactly as you would expect given the behavioral data, and that is that you see an increase with the positive and an increase when negative images are viewed. The amygdala is the region of the brain involved in storing emotional memory. In older adults, however, we see this increase when they view positive images but not negative images, which suggests that the images are not being stored in memory. Prior to the time we did this study, there had been only one other study done examining amygdala activation by age, and they had only used negative stimuli when they did the study. And so their conclusion had been, that the amygdala is broken. Look, everything else is going wrong. But the amygdala, also considered to be a salience indicator, is working just fine. It's just that it looks like the salience of these different stimuli may be different for older and younger people. What we've been thinking is that these kinds of findings suggest that cognition is coming to work in the service of emotion regulation. That is, what you attend to, what you remember, affects how you feel. So if people in day-to-day life are pursuing goals about feeling good, feeling satisfied, finding meaning in life, they're more likely to look to attend to process more positive aspects of life. So overall, we're thinking this is a good thing. Of course, one day I get a phone call. Was it a phone call or a knock on the door? Doug Shadell shows up and says, I've been reading your work, and I'm interested in financial fraud, and older people are at great risk. And maybe it's because they're attending more to the positive than the negative. And so we started to think a lot about that and have now done, as Doug mentioned, several studies together. But I'll show you the findings from one study that we did where we were measuring or examining the anticipation of reward. So again, things that you've heard this morning are that one of the factors that in all likelihood put people at risk for falling for some sort of a scam is the anticipation that something good may happen, and perhaps a failure to weigh that with anticipation of potential negative outcomes. We ran a study with a colleague of mine here at Stanford, Brian Knudsen, and had younger and older people play what is called a mid-task. I'll explain that to you momentarily, while they're in a brain scanner. The mid-task is the acronym for monetary incentive delay task. It's a task where people play a game where they win money and lose money. And everybody, the game is rigged, so everybody who participates wins and loses money. So we have win trials and loss trials. People are playing this game while they're in a brain scan, so we can look at activation. And what happens is that they first see a cue. And the cues range from you're going to win $5 to lose $5. And in steps of 50 cents to 25 cents and so on goes up. So this is a big win. So you see a cue. If you're in the brain scanner, you see this in view. There's then a 2-second delay. There's a target that appears for about half a second and then disappears. And you as a participant have to press a button very quickly in order to win money or avoid losing money in the trials. There's then another delay, and then you get feedback. You won $5 or you lost $5. And then there's another delay, and then this is repeated through many different trials. What we're interested in is this delay. So what happens after the person understands that they might lose or might win? What's happening in the brain right in here before they play the game? Now, we also were interested in how they responded if they lost or won money. But I'll tell you the answer right now. Older and younger people don't differ in their responses, their neural responses to winning and losing money. So they look just the same. That's if they lose. But we were interested in what they're expecting. What's happening in neural regions involved in reward anticipation when people are anticipating a reward or a loss. And what you see here in this slide is a composite of the activation and the anterior insula and caudate nucleus in younger brains on this part of the panel, on the left side of the panel, and older brains on the right. And we don't find any significant differences here. So the neural activation on game trials, when people might win money, look the same. But on loss trials, they look very different. Younger people are showing activation in the same regions that we see on game trials, but in older people, we don't see much activation in those regions at all, suggesting that older people aren't responding negatively to the potential of losing. But as I say, if they lose, when they lose, they look indistinguishable from younger people, neurally and subjectively. Older people don't like to lose money any more than younger people do. But I think of this in some ways as they don't go there findings. Older people aren't going to be concerned about something going wrong unless it goes wrong. If it goes wrong, then you see this kind of response, but not in anticipation of the response. I've also heard people say this morning, as I was listening, that there are gains and losses associated with age. I think you were saying this when you were talking about wisdom. Sure, we get slower, less agile in certain ways, but there are also gains that occur. And we think that this motivational shift is also associated with gains and losses. Focusing on the positive side of life, pursuing goals that are emotionally meaningful and give you great satisfaction are really positive changes. We expect that they also contribute, along with this increase in knowledge, to wisdom that people are experiencing and regulating their emotions better as they get older. But in some contexts, in some situations, those same changes that seem to be adaptive in day-to-day life may put older people in a particularly precarious kind of a situation. And we think it may well be that one of them may be related to deception and fraud. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Evolutionary pressures that might distinguish this last slide that you showed us why people might have loss appreciation.
I've thought about the changes that we see developmentally in terms of something called the grandmother hypothesis that an anthropologist named Kristen Hawkes has developed. And she argues that we're growing as old as we are as a species, that is aging past menopause, because of the value of older members of a family or a group. And that is, if we think back to the Africa savanna as we're walking 10 miles a day and hunting and gathering and living in small bands, it would be really good to have somebody as part of your group who knows a lot. Doesn't matter if they're so fast, but they know where that animal usually is. And they know where to go for certain kinds of nuts and berries and so on. And so that kind of a value, I think, may be there. But emotionally, having somebody as part of your group who can solve problems, who seems to be able to regulate their emotions in a steady, stable way, who's not flying off angry and worried and stressed as much as the younger members of the group, can also have great adaptive value to a group. But it may mean that part of the strategy of achieving that, again, would put somebody at risk in other ways. So it's not so much that I think of an adaptive value to being vulnerable to deception as much as the positive view of this. That is that focusing on what's good in life and good in people may be very good for a group.
So I have a question. I'm wondering, as you look towards the later stages of life, how the socioeconomic selectivity theory would apply to such things as a shift from self and being self-centered towards perhaps altruism, which almost implies, I mean, it's a broader horizon to look at. But then temporally, as one thinks about planned giving and things beyond their own life, there might be a shift. And so the actual time horizon might extend through multiple generations, either through legacy or through donation to charities. And I'm just wondering if you could frame that particular piece.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think this has a lot to do with legacy. I mean, the two things that people are becoming more interested in doing something that really matters, that's meaningful. And for most people, as I said, if you ask them what's most meaningful, it's their families, it's their children. Or it's a beloved institution or work or something. But for most people, it's very clear to them what's so important, and they invest in it. And that is legacy, in a sense. So investing, leaving money to family members, to causes, and so on is really good. I'm actually really optimistic about aging societies, because I think that we are entering a historical era where for the first time in human history, we're going to have millions of older citizens who are going to be knowledgeable, emotionally stable, and who see what's important and care about it. And that's got to be good for a society. So I think that's part of it. There's always a downside to everything. I think this thing about legacy often leads older people to underspend their money. We've been worried about people running out of money today in this room, but there's a substantial number of older people who underspend their assets because they're saving it for others, and they want to leave it to.
I'll just make the comment. It looks as though some of that may be related to experiences in childhood due to the depression.
Certainly, there are also generational differences. Yeah, right.
Thanks. I was wondering how your socio-emotional selectivity theory explains, so when you're looking at the positive emotions, you see them going up with age, but then you've got the last where it starts to come down. And so with the time horizon you're really talking about, that's really decreasing right there. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, two things. One is we're not sure it's a reliable downward turn. So, and if it is, it's really modest. So people are still relatively happy. But clearly other factors influence people's well-being. And this isn't a theory that would say that minute by minute, the closer you get to death, the happier you get. There's clearly a time in life where things don't look so good for most people toward the very end. And so when you get to the 80s and 90s, you're much more close to the end of your life. But rather, the theory is sort of about how do you view the future across adulthood, and not so much about end of life or end of life decisions. It may play out a little bit there, but I think that's probably so. Two things. One is I'm not sure it's even a downturn, and these data don't speak to it, I should say. it won't necessarily run out. It's much more about the view over decades of life and how you see the future ahead of you, as opposed to your last 2 weeks.
So it seems like other things come into play.
Sure,
maybe
absolutely, absolutely. And physical health affects how people feel. So if you're sick and you're old, you don't feel good and you're in pain, you're not going to be feeling as well as if you're not. There is some evidence that older people who are sick and in pain and suffering, if you compare them to young people who have the same disease, older people are doing better than the younger people. But so you still may see some relative advantage. But yeah, those things do take a toll. Yes.
There are a number of excellent books out there, like yours, of course, and Barbara's.
And Barbara's, yes.
And there's quite a bit of wonderful research that I've been able to find over the last year or so on this wonderful topic of aging and cognition. But I've seen very little, if almost any, research done in Japan and China and India. And yet I suspect that there must be quite a bit of research done in those areas. I was wondering if you could talk to that.
Sure. There is, although there hasn't been nearly as much of social science research on aging in China. And I don't know about India. Do you know, Rita? On social issues, as there is in the United States. So I don't know that there's a whole lot more there. We have done some work in Hong Kong and Beijing, Taiwan, where we've tested hypotheses from this same theory, and we replicate those in those parts of the world. So we have a little bit of information there. But I don't, I think if you look at just general survey data on well-being, we're seeing relative improvements in well-being in many parts of the world. I can't speak comprehensively about all of them, but there are a number of efforts now to construct large countrywide, sort of representative samples along the lines of the HRS, the study that I mentioned that David Leibson is using. And generally speaking, they're seeing relatively positive well-being in older as compared to younger people. But I don't know enough about the findings to speak specifically, for India or China. Thanks. Hi.
Or not surprisingly, a question about emotion regulation. Socioemotional selectivity theory is just a wonderfully insightful way of thinking about sort of how you develop cognitive processes to adapt to the time sense. But I've also been intrigued with a comment that that we all heard earlier on about, how people who are doing deceptive marketing try to get seniors into the ether by arousing emotion. And some of us were commenting that this sounds a little bit like what we were hearing yesterday at Hastings about the ways in which rational decision-making by adolescents may get undermined when they're in heightened emotion states. There's no reason to think that the processes are parallel, but from an emotion regulation standpoint, do you have any comments, either psychologically or neurobiologically, about the efficacy of getting them into that emotional ether as it relates to their, as the telemarketers say, making it possible to then completely manipulate them once they're in that emotional state?
Yeah, but the question is, how does that happen? How do you get people there, or what is it about that state?
Well, I think it seems to suggest that across developmental spectrums, we talk about this with toddlers as well. When they get emotion, they're not reasoning. That's true of seniors, adolescents, and the rest. Yeah. But if you were thinking about how it is that seniors are regulating emotion, as socioemotional selectivity theory does it make them more vulnerable, therefore, when they are induced into that heightened state, or do we have any knowledge about that?
Yeah, no, it's really an interesting question. A couple things. One is, older people place more value on calm, positive emotional states than younger people do. So it may well be that it's easier to work, I sort of put my money on this, it's easier to work a young person into an emotional lather, excitement, and so on than it is an older person. So there's that piece of it. There's one piece of it that, again, I think these are very much context dependent. So if somebody's in front of you, a person trying to sell you something, and you're trying to manage and have a positive social interaction in that, it's different than if you're trying to make a decision about a loan in your office or whatever, about how to spend legacy funds. You know, it's a different sort of a situation. In some sense, we have some evidence, I should say, that older people make better decisions when they rely on their emotions than when they engage in highly deliberative practices. So we ran one study where we asked people to make choices about different healthcare plans, and we gave them bits of information about these different plans, and in one condition, and every time they gave them a bit of information, we'd say, now try to remember everything you can about this plan, and the other one was, really focus on how you feel about the plan. And then at the end, we asked them to make a choice from among these different options, and those older people who were in the emotion condition made better quality decisions than people in the deliberating condition. So I think there's actually, it's just, I guess I'm muddling here because I don't really know the answer, and I think it's nuanced and complicated. There are times when relying on our gut, how we feel about somebody, is a really good indication of information that's valuable. And there are times when it can completely lead us astray.
Is it possible that if you are one who values a positive emotional state, that you are more vulnerable once somebody has gotten you out of that? As you know, as socioemotional selectivity theory would suggest, that if you are orienting a lot of your cognitive processes toward maintaining that state of relative balance,
Right.
then somebody who can really jar you out of that has a greater effect upon your cognitive process, as opposed to a young adult who's in all sorts of emotions. And,
It's really interesting. I find it fascinating. I don't know the answer, but I find it fascinating. I'm looking at Doug because I'm thinking, I wonder, what it makes me wonder is, are older people more likely to fall for the scams where you're harassed with negative emotion? Where the person's saying, you better make a decision, you better do it right now, than the ones where the charming young guy knocks on your door day after day and sells you the same policy.
There's a comment I interviewed who said it doesn't matter.
Doug, use the mic, please.
Oh, sorry. We interviewed a guy, Jim Vitale, who said that he sold as many people with the positive, you're going to make a lot of money, as he did with the guy who decided it was a scam and called him back to chew him out. And he let him chew him out, and it was all anger.
Yeah.
But anger's just another emotion.
Yeah.
And he goes, in some ways, that's just as easy as the positive emotion. It doesn't really matter. Yeah. Either way, they're off balance, and I can control them.
So now what you're saying makes me think it's arousal. That it's not valence, but it's arousal. That high arousal in older adults may put them at risk.
Maybe we've learned
But
something.
positive emotions wouldn't in and of themselves put them at risk. Let's test that hypothesis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Two more questions.
So I had a question in the 2009 PhD that Dr. Hal Eisner Hirschfeld did with you. I was wondering if in a way the use of one's own image, their visage, aged 50 years, was in a way the ultimate persuader. We're talking about being in the world of the con artist. To meet one's self from the future, if that in a way positions it in similar vein. And if so, since you did do fMRI studies, could we ask if they were in the ether?
It's really interesting. If I only knew what in the ether was. But it is, so this is a study where that we did with Jeremy Bailenson here, and Hal Eisner Hirschfeld was the lead on this. We had younger and older people come into the laboratory. We took a photograph of them and then created a digital avatar. In one condition, it was the same age as the person was at that time, and another, we morphed it to be 50 years older. And then they went into, using virtual reality, interacted with this avatar for 30 minutes, and then we asked them to make decisions about saving for retirement, and those who had interacted with their aging selves allocated more than twice as much money in this experiment to retirement than people who had not. And so what you're suggesting is this whole, we thought it was, establishing a visceral connection between the young person and their future self. Now, you could call that a con man, but it probably works in their favor, but yeah.
I think in the context in which it appeared in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2011, there are certain people in the reverse mortgage industry and the annuity industry are looking at this as a very exciting opportunity for them And really all they want to do is to convert it from being 3D to 2D, which in fact was the very last page of the PhD. I actually don't think it can be done. I think that the 3D element, the immersive element, was a critical part, and I think a study would show that. Then the only just observation would be, I'm wondering if instead of thinking of saving for themselves, the subjects were in fact in groups of 50 or 70 years old, and they were thinking about an altruistic opportunity and envisioning something beyond their life, a new wing at Stanford, a new hospital, and what types of mental activities would be happening there.
It's great. Chris Bryant, a graduate student in psychology here, has done a study where you use as incentives not saving for yourself for retirement, but saving for your grandchildren. People do better with that. So I think that's right.
So I have a question that led me to sort of think about a possible theory that might tie into this arousal concept. Question is, have you looked at patients that have depression and your functional MR studies of the amygdala? And what I'm wondering is it possible that younger people are exploring positive and negative pictures, and that ultimately those pictures are building their reward system, their dopamine system, their addiction system, and that for most people, or let's say most people, as time goes on, the positive pictures are the ones that turn on their dopamine system and that they become addicted to. And then as they age, the things that are there, that's their reward system hardwired now, and that's what you're seeing in your studies.
Oh, interesting.
And that it potentially, you know, that then might be the reward system is all the arousal system and the anticipation, and that's what you're building with this model that you have. And that if you were able to take patients that maybe are depressed over a long period of time, it's possible that for them, that a negative picture actually is a familiar place. They build that in their addictive system, and that potentially, if you looked at depressed older patients or those that had been depressed over a lifetime, that maybe you might find the exact inverse, but that both groups are actually activating their dopamine reward system.
Very, very interesting. So dopamine declines with age a lot. Actually, there are some people who think that because of when dopamine levels decline, it seems to hurt cognitive functioning but improve emotional functioning. And some people think there may be something related to that here. But a couple things. One is I'm married to Ian Gottlieb, a professor in psychology here at Stanford who studies depression, and we tried for years to run a study on depressed elderly with your hypothesis to test it, thinking that we wouldn't see the positivity effect at all, and people with depression. We could not find a sample of older adults who were clinically depressed, speaking to the positivity effect. Now, this is there are depressed elderly, and I know a lot of you know them, but we were looking for depression that was not comorbid with dementia or anxiety or other disorders because we wanted to test this clean depression. And it's really hard to find people who are elderly who are only depressed. Really hard. I mean, we tried for 2 years to find this sample, and we had hired people to, do skid interviews and so on. We weren't able to do it, so that's all I can say about that. I don't know the answer, but we had your hypothesis. But the second one is a really important question, and that is there something happening in terms of neural degradation or some sort of neural change that is selectively affecting the processing of negative information but not positive? That was clearly an alternative explanation to this motivational account of positivity when we first started investigating it. Absolutely, and we were interested in it too. It doesn't appear to be the case. The reason we say that, I say that, is we can eliminate this behaviorally by giving people new goals to be very focused on information, goals to be attentive to detail, and so on. We eliminate it. So we can get rid of these memory effects. We can, with fairly simple kinds of behavioral interventions, speaking against some intractable, biological explanation for the change. Thank you.
Well, great talk as always, Laura. Thank you very much.